Welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. You can subscribe to our show on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or add our RSS feed to your podcatcher of choice. You can also follow us on Twitter or Google+, and please give us feedback. You can leave a review on iTunes so that other people can find us, send us a tweet, send us an email, leave us a message on Google+, or leave a comment on our show notes. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. For details on how to support the show, you can visit our site at pythonpodcast.com. I would also like to thank Hired, a job marketplace for developers, for sponsoring this episode of Podcast.init. Use the link hired.com/podcastinit to double your signing bonus. Linode is also sponsoring us this week. Check them out at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $10 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for your next project. We are recording today on November 30th, 2015, and your hosts as usual are Tobias Macy and Chris Patty. Today we are interviewing Eric Holscher about documentation and read the docs. Eric, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I've been a Python developer now for about 8 years. I started out of university at the Lawrence Journal World in Lawrence, Kansas, where Django was from, and then I moved out to Portland about 5 years ago and had a job at Urban Airship, and then been working on kind of read the docs and documentation related projects for the past 5 years or so. So, yeah.
Very cool. So how did you get started with the Python language?
When I was in high school, I learned Perl because that's how you made things on the internet. And when I was in college, I was kind of looking for something else that was, maybe a little more forward-looking and similar philosophy. And I kind of ended up looking at Python and actually ended up reading kind of the Django documentation on a Thanksgiving trip in my senior year. And it kind of just taught me Python. It taught me web development. It taught me just about everything that I needed to know. And from there, it was kind of the classic, come into the Python world through Django and kind of get involved with both.
Yeah, and Django has always had a pretty extensive set of documentation and a really good introductory section, which they've actually been improving as of late. So being that this is a show about documentation, it's kind of fitting that that was your intro into Python and the overall ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely. And I gave a talk at Django birthday, actually, which is kind of like Django's 10th birthday. There was a little bit about that, about kind of the very circular nature of documentation in the ecosystem, I think, where, people get involved through it and then they really see the value in it and help kind of make it a community, kind of something that community values.
Definitely. And so, as we've alluded to, you're one of the people behind the Read the Docs project. And what was your inspiration for creating that platform, and why is documentation so important in software?
It was really just, the classic kind of scratching an itch. I had a few open source projects that I had documentation for, and I had just, they were on my personal website, and I had just like a cron job running every half an hour, pulling down the Git branch and, running Sphinx's make HTML command and copying them into a web directory. And that was kind of the state of the art at that time. And it was like, hey, we're developers, we have, GitHub, we have webhooks, we have all these kind of tools that have just come out and make a lot of sense in this problem space. And so that was really, it was the actual creation was done in 48 hours in the Django Dash in 2010 with Bobby Grace and Charles Leifer. And it was really just like something we thought we could kind of bite off. And, it was like a simple enough core of an idea that we could do it in 48 hours and actually, have something functional. And so it was really just kind of on a whim. We're like, yeah, this is the right size project for this type of competition. And so, yeah, we kind of just created it. I think we got third place in the competition, which I was happy about, right? I think there was like 30 or 40 other people. And then just from there, it's kind of just grown into something much larger than I ever thought it would be.
And so is the underlying infrastructure for Read the Docs still a Django project?
It is, yeah. It's all an open source Django project. It's on the RTFD GitHub org, and it's linked from the footer and lots of different places, or if you just search for it. But yeah, it's still a big Django app.
So what makes Read the Docs different from other static sources for documentation?
So I think the cool thing, so Read the Docs is predominantly built on Sphinx. We also support MakeDocs, which is another kind of Python doc generator. And what we kind of build on top of that is really kind of the, hosting and version control awareness. So, most of those tools just deal with, a set of files sitting on a file system. And we actually implement a lot of the logic around, different tags, different branches, URL structures, hosting, and like the updating mechanisms where we automatically run it, on every commit. So it's kind of the, keeping things up to date and that kind of deployment story, which is always really hard with all software, right? And so really, we're just kind of building on top of the tools that deal with the actual files to really give it more functionality.
Yeah, and my understanding is that you also support documentation from other languages than just Python. And so in order to provide that support, do those other languages just need to leverage the Sphinx toolchain? Or do you also have other support for other systems?
Yeah, correct. So MakeDocs doesn't really have any kind of language support. It's just a kind of a markdown tool that just does markdown files. And so we actually have added markdown support to Sphinx. So that's one of the big reasons we added MakeDocs. And so now if you want to use markdown, you can use, either tool. But Sphinx really has, so much more power where it has kind of the concept of domains, which then allows you to document, arbitrary sets of software. So there's like a Python, a C++, JavaScript, Go, .NET, a bunch of different domains for different languages that allow you to kind of document those specific, language constructs where, every programming language, or most of them at least, has the concept of like a class and a function and a method, but they often have different names. And so it just allows you to have that kind of semantic mapping where it's like, in JavaScript, they're called, prototypes, and in Python, they're called classes, and just allowing you to actually kind of use the proper language-specific semantics. And so that's how Sphinx supports all the different languages that it does.
And have you had anybody give you feedback from other languages about any issues that they've had with using Sphinx because of its being written primarily in Python, or has it been a pretty easy on-ramp for people from languages such as Ruby or Go or any of those others that you mentioned?
Yeah, so the classic issue is that the auto doc functionality, where, you kind of take a piece of code and you pull the documentation strings out dynamically, has been lacking from all the other languages except for Python. Because Sphinx was, it's implemented in Python, but it was also originally built to document Python itself. So it still has, a set of features in the core that are specific to Python. And that's been slowly, going away as Sphinx has become much more of a, tool that's used by all the different language developers. But that's one of the things we're actually working on, kind of in the Read the Docs world, is a project we're calling Sphinx Auto Api, which is the attempt to actually bring that kind of auto documentation concept to all the other different languages. So that work was actually funded by Microsoft because they're using Read the Docs and Sphinx for their ASP.NET documentation. And so they wanted to be able to kind of auto-generate, reference documentation for their .NET sources. And so we added, that mapper that takes, the platform-specific, metadata tool. So, like PHP doc or whatever the tool is that kind of pulls the documentation out of the source code. And we kind of have the mapper that turns that into the proper Sphinx markup. So that was one of the things we built there. And we're hoping to kind of have that be that bridge for other languages to be better supported in the Sphinx ecosystem.
And the Python community seems to have a stronger focus on well-documented projects than some of the other languages that I've used. I'm wondering if you have any theories as to why that is the case.
Yeah, it's one of those things I've always kind of been curious about. And, I know Jacob Kaplan-Moss was one of my big influences around documentation. And so I think a lot of it comes from the top, the Django core people, the Python core people. There's just kind of that good good documentation at the top, and that really leads to setting a community standard. If the core language isn't well documented, the chances of the libraries being well documented is pretty low. But for example, the Django community, there's an expectation of documentation that has kind of Django started, but now the community has kind of taken. And that was really one of our goals with Read the Docs, was to kind of be able to take that Python documentation culture and kind of export it to other language communities. So if we give people really good tools for writing documentation, it will make it much easier for people to kind of do documentation well. And so that might be one of the other kind of, my pet theories is that, Sphinx, in my opinion, is kind of the best. It's certainly the most fleshed out kind of open source documentation tool. A lot of other language communities, all they have is kind of the Java doc style, reference from source code generation tooling. And they don't have anything that really supports kind of the prose, allow me to, explain what it's going on and then let me show you a reference. And being able to kind of mix auto-generated documentation with, handwritten and edited prose. That was one of the big things that Sphinx did that I think the Python community does really well. And so many other people just have, auto-generated, from source code documentation. And that's really kind of the state of the art in those communities.
And even then they have it, but how much they use it is very much up for debate, right? Like Ruby has RubyDoc, but it's not baked into the language in the same way that Python's even source code level generated documentation is. So it's used a lot more sparsely and a lot less often, in my experience anyway. So I think it really is interesting to see how sort of, really strong support for these kinds of features in sort of the DNA of the language percolate out through the community and really make this kind of thing possible. And you mentioned the enhancements that Sphinx brings to the table. It's almost like, it makes me wonder if Python had not provided that really sort of great foundation, if Sphinx would have ever built on top of it in the way that it did.
Yeah, and this was two things. I think both Go and Rust both have really, really good documentation practices. Like GoDoc, it seems to be the kind of community standard there, and it's used almost everywhere. Even though it is a very kind of simplistic, generate from source code into, a website, just the fact that it's used everywhere means that people are writing those doc strings and, making that tool worthwhile. And Rust as well just has really, really, advanced documentation stuff built into the language and Rust doc and all this kind of stuff. So it's cool to see the next generation really getting this right. And it really kind of makes me happy. And then kind of the second kind of more meta, I think you asked for pet theories. And this is one of my favorites, is kind of the comparison around continuous integration and documentation, testing and documentation, where I believe that kind of maybe 5 or 10 years ago, testing was this thing that developers saw as like a net negative, where it's like I write tests and they never get run and then they go out of date and they break. And then the time I spent writing them was wasted. And so I think the continuous integration kind of becoming a standard part of software development really helped testing turn into a net positive for developers, where they write the tests, they get run on every commit. And then if they break, as long as your culture is to fix them, then those tests really do have a lot of value in the development process. And I think that, documentation for a long time, people would write, poor documentation, then people wouldn't read it. And so then, the act of writing documentation was a net negative because you spent time and that time didn't, have commensurate value in return. And so a lot of our kind of my worldview with Read the Docs is really how do we increase the value and, flip that feedback loop around so that writing documentation is a net positive for developers. And I think having a documentation kind of community around a project and a language is a huge part of that, right? For Python developers, their documentation gets read, and so it's really beneficial for them to write it. But for example, if you're maybe a Ruby developer or a JavaScript developer, the community isn't in the same way. Writing a README will be valuable, but maybe writing really, good documentation might not be quite as valuable just because it won't be read by nearly as many people.
And also, too, you're bringing up the correlation of documentation and testing, it also has an interesting sort of confluence in Python with the doc test module as well, being able to actually have your documentation be useful beyond just from a human perspective and actually be machine consumable to ensure that your source code and your documentation are lining up appropriately. And that's another way of verifying when they start to drift apart, because that's one of the other things that I've noticed a lot of times is that if the documentation is even marginally separated from the actual source code, it's much more likely to get out of date. Whereas I think the way that Python supports docstrings being part of the actual function body makes it much more likely that you will review it as you are modifying the source code and thereby actually keep it up to date, as opposed to letting it, fall out of sync and become essentially useless.
Yeah, definitely. We always call that kind of the wiki problem, where, at a lot of companies, documentation is stored in a wiki, and the act of, having to go to a separate place and update things just means that it never gets done. And so, I think having that, as close to the source code as you can possibly get, like doc strings are the best, but then in repo, markdown or restructure text is, the second best in that regard. So, I think that's a huge part of it as well.
Since we've mentioned DocTest and Sphinx, can you outline the rest of the landscape of projects that leverage the documentation capabilities that are built into the Python language?
Yeah, I think, DocTest is really interesting. And then Sphinx actually has a DocTest module built in as well that extends that a little bit, that lets you kind of do similar style DocTest things inside of Sphinx. So you can have it so you can, so in that use case, it's really being able to test the examples in your documentation, which is similar to the docstring use case, but a little bit different. And then MakeDocs is one of the other ones that's really been catching on, and it's much more of just a traditional kind of static site generator. A few of the other ones are kind of the, documentation reference generators. There's things like Epidoc and PyDoctor. I think those are all pretty out of date. Epidoc, I know, doesn't support Python 3 at least in its parse only mode. I don't know about how it imports software, or when it actually imports the code to generate the documentation. But I believe it's only Python 2 and doesn't support Python 3 at all. And PyDoctor is actually something that's broken out of the Twisted world, and so they're still kind of turning it into more of a generic tool. And then I think there's PyDoc that actually ships with Python, but it just generates the most like making your eyes bleed HTML you can imagine. But I don't know if there's a huge amount of other kind of documentation tools. There's things that are kind of downstream, like Dash, which is really great. So Dash kind of is just a generic kind of local, I think it's OS X only, but there's ports for Windows and Linux that lets you have kind of offline documentation locally on your machine. In that regard, those are really the big kind of doc things in the Python world. And maybe I'm, ignoring some important ones, and feel free to point out if I am.
Yeah, well, given the huge number of projects available in the Python ecosystem, nobody can expect you to actually keep tabs on all the different libraries that are available for leveraging docstrings. So.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, if you're just generating a set of, like a list of, alphabetically sorted list of modules or whatever, there's not that much innovation those tools can really provide. And I think, the Sphinx's approach of kind of mixing, auto-generated and, kind of human-written text is definitely kind of the proper solution in my mind. But pure API references are really valuable in terms of just being a reference, where if you're an advanced programmer and you already know, what you're doing and you just need to kind of be able to reference things. But in terms of actually learning and understanding the software, they're not that great of a tool.
So can you estimate the overall user base for Read the Docs?
Yeah. So I was just jumped in a terminal before the call here, so I had kind of up-to-date numbers, and I think we're at 26,000 projects. And with that, we have 37,000 users. Those are people that are actually, have created user accounts. But yeah, with Read the Docs, the kind of interesting thing, right, is that, it's a one-to-many publishing platform in a lot of ways. Like if you're just a consumer of documentation, most people that use Read the Docs every day, don't really even have accounts. They just are, reading the hosted documentation. And so, the best numbers we have for that is Google Analytics. And so I think the last time I looked, we were at 17 million page views a month. Yeah, and so that's a little over 4 million unique visitors each month that are, viewing documentation that's hosted on Read the Docs.
Wow, that's a pretty incredible scale that you're operating at there.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing to me a little bit.
And do you have any sort of sponsorship or, donation income to help support the infrastructure necessary to facilitate that sort of traffic?
Yeah, so Rackspace is incredibly generous, and they actually donate all of our servers. So yeah, we're given up to $5,000 a month in Rackspace credit, which is just amazingly great. And they've been supporting the project for I don't even know, as long as I can really remember. It's been at least 2 or 3 years. And then we did a donation campaign that raised $24,000 earlier this year, and that was actually to fund 3 months of kind of support and operations work. Because as we're not a standard open source project where the source code is not the kind of product that we're really giving people. It's really the hosting and the uptime and the operations, right? Like part of being in a services business is or infrastructure is like the docs can't go down. I've been at like the PyCon sprints, and I've done a deployment that accidentally broke our servers, and it was like 5 minutes later everyone's like very angry at me. So really, yeah, the big cost for us is support and operations. And so we're about to launch in the next couple weeks kind of a Read the Docs Gold, which is similar to like Reddit or Trello, where it's $10-15 a month. That's mostly geared towards kind of individuals to support the project. And then we're also looking at doing some more kind of formal fundraising focused at corporations. So I know the Django project just kind of hired their first fundraiser officially. And I think that, in general, kind of sustainability and supporting open source projects in the long term is really one of the big outstanding issues in the open source community, and something I'm very intimately involved with, and it's material to my livelihood. So it's something that I realize we haven't always been great at. I think in general, a lot of open source, you can't even give them money, and Read the Docs has been pretty bad about this. And so we're really trying to think through how to do it responsibly, but really find a way to make it sustainable. And I think at least, pay the people that are carrying pagers, because that is not a fun job, and doing it for free for too long definitely will burn you out. And so that's really, the goal in terms of sustainability is, operations, and then just kind of support of the users. It's like, hey, I lost my password, or somebody else took my project name, or just the kind of things that, have to be done from an administrative point of view.
Yeah, that's a conversation that's been repeated a number of times recently, of the figuring out how to make open source more sustainable from a financial perspective, and trying to convince companies that use open source for being successful to actually contribute back to the projects that they make use of.
I have a half-drafted blog post, and it's something I really feel that I should be contributing to, and I'm just trying to find exactly what I want to say, because I have so many thoughts that it's really hard to kind of break that down into the meat of really what I can uniquely add to the conversation.
Yeah, there's definitely a general problem to be wrangled with, and even beyond open source per se, just in the sense of you're trying to do something for the community, yet it costs money to keep the lights on, yet you don't want to become so obnoxious to your users that they end up resenting the fact that you've, gone for sponsorship. I mean, that's a balance we've tried to strike with this podcast as well, and hopefully we've been successful at it. That's definitely something that I, feel like I'm more than happy to pitch in for shared resources. I think it's important to give people the opportunity to help, to be sure.
Yeah, and but at the end of the day, individual contributions are not the answer. Like I kind of view, in a lot of ways, I've started to view Read the Docs as a library, and libraries are supported with taxes, because if it was up to people just individually contributing, they wouldn't get funded. And really, I view it as something that, like, things like Read the Docs and, infrastructure like PyPy and, Travis and all these things should be effectively a tax on the venture capital industry. And maybe not just venture capital, but, kind of the tech industry as a general, in general. And, people hate the tax word. And, that obviously I'm not in marketing, but in general, yeah, it's a pretty classic tragedy of the commons, where if people don't have to pay for something and it feels like it will be supported by the community, it will end up not getting funded appropriately. And yeah, I think the nonprofit world and lots of other folks have dealt with this for a long time, and there's certainly a lot of information and there's people that have dealt with this that we should be learning from, and it's really, a lot of it I think is just raising awareness and making it more of a social pressure where it's like, oh, hey, you're a big company, like, what open source do you support? As when I interview, right? Like, if I'm a candidate for a job, or, we have to find a way that it can really be leveraged into something that affects, the material, like, business that they're doing. So it's like, oh, I couldn't hire this person because we're not supporting open source, or things like this is where you'll really start to actually get traction, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting debate, and one that has very, very many different viewpoints and approaches that it's definitely will be interesting to see how it pans out over the coming months and years as the discussion continues.
Yeah, I just think it's a healthy sign that the discussion is happening. Like, I think 5 years ago, money was like the third rail of open source
right.
In a lot of ways. And just seeing the conversation happening is a huge improvement.
Yeah, it's definitely become much more visible as open source has continued to gain ground, and so many more open source projects are becoming critical to large businesses. So, do you have any advice around methods or approaches that can help developers create and maintain effective documentation and make sure that it doesn't go out of date?
Really, I think kind of there's one thing that I think is kind of the baseline that everything else depends on, which is kind of, as I mentioned earlier, keeping your documentation as close to your source code as possible. So yeah, putting doc strings and things inside your source files that are appropriate, but there's always going to be content, like tutorials and support information and stuff that obviously doesn't belong inside of source code, and that should live inside of your repository, right, in a docs directory. And then you just need to, mandate the documentation is updated whenever you change code. So basically implementing a process around pull requests that, requires documentation for new features, as well as, updating of documentation for, features that are currently in the code base. And that's really, I know the Django project has had this forever, where code won't be committed without tests and without documentation, and that's really, I think, just kind of the baseline for making sure and giving developers kind of the tools to allow them to make sure their documentation is up to date. You just kind of integrate it into the pull request kind of workflow that everybody's using, or whatever review process you have for updating your code. Beyond that, it's really just, using good tools, knowing how they work. I think a lot of people just cargo cult a lot of things. And so people might not be familiar with that term, but yeah, they just kind of, it's copy and paste, right? Where, people are using Sphinx and restructured text, or Markdown even, and really not knowing what they should be doing and knowing how the tools can really help them. But yeah, I mean, and really, if you're big enough and you can kind of work at a company that has a technical writer, or if you're an open source project and you can attract people like that, Hopefully it's getting easier. I think, tech writers for a long time have been, detached from development of source code, but with, APIs getting prominence and all this kind of stuff, I think they're getting more and more involved with the actual development of software. So hopefully they'll find their way into the open source community and not get repelled. But yeah, I think just caring about it and knowing that you need to update it and you need to care about it when you're writing code is super important. And so one of the other methods that I use is kind of documentation-driven development, which is, I think, is really valuable for software design as well as documentation. So if you sit down before you write a little service or a project and, build out an example README file that has, the basic user-facing API, kind of the design decisions that you're making, where it's like, we're implementing this instead of using these 2 or 3 existing libraries because these are our goals, and here is, why those things don't solve them. And just really kind of being able to think through in writing why and how that software is going to be used will make the implementation much better. Because I think a lot of people have a habit of just going in and solving a problem in software and then not thinking about how the API is going to be represented to the end user. So you end up with software that kind of has this layer in the middle that has to translate how it works internally to how it's used externally. And I think writing documentation first that really thinks through how it will be used by the end user really makes for better software design and implementation, as well as better documentation, because the software is by definition easier to explain because it's, it was thought through from the beginning. And so that's more of a kind of development methodology, but I really do think that, thinking through documentation and, user experience before you create software really does help both in the internal design as well as the usability for the user at the end of it.
Yeah, there's a post I referenced as in a pic a few episodes ago called Blog Post Driven Development. That was about a company where whenever they need to implement a new feature, they'll get together and hash out a blog post describing the new feature. So essentially they're writing the post about the release before they actually implement the feature as a way to drive out design decisions and the things that people outside of the company are actually going to care about, so that they make sure that they're staying focused on the necessary problems that they're solving.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's really a wise approach. And I think it's true for most disciplines. I know, kind of user experience and all these kind of things, right? Like if you don't think through how something's going to be used and even, validation, like there's nothing worse than, writing code that never gets used because nobody needed it. So, really, really thinking through that kind of whole, product process before you actually sit down to write stuff makes, the documentation, makes the UX, makes the design, it really makes everything easier, kind of getting all of those parts of the organization involved or even just all those parts of your brain if it's just you. But really thinking through that full process is incredibly valuable, but it's super non-obvious as a developer where your first instinct is just to sit down and, figure out how it works by solving the problem.
Right, and particularly with the recent emphasis on Agile and or TDD methods that, where you just list the different features that you need. And so you say, okay, I'm just going to pick the, top item from the backlog and work on it and then go to the next one. So you're somewhat discouraged from doing a lot of design work up front and you're supposed to just drive out the design as you go. Whereas that can be beneficial from a perspective of, getting started quickly. It can also be detrimental in terms of, as you said, not thinking through the overall experience appropriately. So I think that there's been so much pushback against the waterfall method that any sense, that people have started to see any sort of upfront design work as being a regression back into that methodology, whereas it does definitely have a very valuable proposition in terms of how it relates to the end product.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, as with anything, there's balance, right? If you're if you're writing something that can, easily be encapsulated in unit tests and is a very logical, thing that is either yes or no or true or false, then yeah, you don't need a lot from that. But yeah, like the larger the problems and the more kind of interesting they get, the more you get value from kind of having all those different, you don't want the person coming in and telling you that it, can't be done at the end of the process.
So can you list some of the projects that you have found to have the best documentation and what was most remarkable about the projects and the way that they provided the documentation?
Yeah, so I think one of the things a lot of people always think a lot about is kind of the design and user experience. And there's been a few different things lately that have really, I think, kind of shown that this can be done really well. And one of them is kind of just like the API documentation space has gotten really, really interesting, where, you have a lot of, like playgrounds where it's, here's an example of the API documentation, but now you can click this and it'll drop you into a little thing that shows you, a live response of that request. And, people like Stripe will automatically insert your own, development keys into the curl examples or this, stuff like that, where it's literally just, copy and paste and it will, adapt to what you're doing and kind of be relevant to you as the user. Similarly, I really like the trend of, like having the little language switcher that shows you the examples in the different languages where it's like, here's the Python example if you're a Python person, or the JavaScript or the curl or so I think there's been a lot of just kind of UX improvements to make documentation kind of more functional for users. Beyond that, I think really it is just all about the content and, having people that understand what their users want. And so really the best documentation is what was useful for you. And so I think, Django is often cited as having really good documentation, but it can be incredibly infuriating for one user and amazingly perfect for the next. And it's really just, being able to try to provide documentation that kind of you can empathize and understand where the user is coming from so they can kind of get what they need out of it. So, a lot of people provide API references, which is perfect for an incredibly technical library that has, a small surface where it's like, hey, I just need to get in and I know I need this tool and I already know the problem and I just want to use it. But, things like the Django tutorial or the Django girls tutorial, where it's like, hey, I'm just getting started with, programming and web development. And so you need to have a much broader view. So I think the Django girls tutorial does this amazingly well, where they're like, hey, we're going to teach you Django, but we understand that that's not all we have to teach you. And that was one of the kind of views of the Django docs when I first started was, they're teaching me Django, but they're also teaching me good Python practice. They're also teaching me good web development practice. And so I think that's one of the really kind of keys to what I consider kind of good documentation is just knowing that audience, right? Like in your tutorial or your topical guides, being broader and having that kind of breadth that allows people to really understand the problem space, to understand the problems that you're solving. And then, in your API reference documentation, it should be super to the point and obvious. And so I don't have, everyone always asks this question, and I think it's a really hard one to answer because you can show someone an example that you really enjoy, and a lot of people will just judge it on the design, or, they won't really actually understand the person coming into it, which is really where you see value in documentation. But yeah, I think just kind of understanding what good content should be and how to separate out the different, parts of your documentation for different users and when they need them is really, really important to having, kind of good documentation.
Yeah, I'll definitely say that one of the things that often stands out to me when I'm reading through a project's documentation is having a good organizational structure to it. So one of the things that has definitely become commonplace is the getting started section, where it just has a brief overview of this is how you get up and running with the project, if that's all you want to do. And then also having sections for more in-depth treatments of some of the different design decisions or use cases. And then again, also having the API reference. So one of the things I definitely notice when I'm viewing documentation that has poor organization is that I have a much harder time figuring out what I'm supposed to be doing with it, how I'm supposed to be using it, and sometimes I'll actually end up just discarding the project entirely if it doesn't have sufficient documentation because I don't have the time to be digging through the source code to try and analyze what it's actually doing and how and why.
Yeah, and this is one of my primary frustrations with the directory full of Markdown on GitHub approach. That seems to be that a lot of projects seem to use is that it gives you no structure and no kind of guidance, and you're lost in this sea of Markdown, and it's like, where do I go? Where should I start? I'm on this page, but where do I go next? And all those things that really having like a table of contents and next and previous and all those kind of things that a real kind of documentation website give you. To give you that kind of context and that structure and that, confidence that where you are and you're in the right place, and, that kind of stuff I think is super important.
Yeah, even just the next and previous buttons are a huge UX benefit, because I was actually reading through some documentation earlier today that didn't have those buttons, and having to keep scrolling back up to click on the next item in the table of contents was just kind of frustrating, particularly after all my experience with browsing through docs on the Read the Docs site, where it does have that capability. So, newcomers to open source are often encouraged to submit improvements to a project's documentation as a way to get started and become involved with the community. I'm wondering if you have any general advice on how to find and understand some of the undocumented features, or find gaps in the documentation itself for where those improvements are needed.
Yeah, I think especially in the open source world, the beginner onboarding stuff tends to be the worst because the people that tend to write documentation are the experienced people, and it's really hard to kind of maintain that beginner's mindset and really have that that empathy with a person who's just coming. And so it's so easy to kind of assume knowledge and leave parts out. And so I think for a lot of newcomers, really just like using the documentation and getting going and kind of getting introduced to it, and keeping notes around like what errors did I encounter, what commands did I type that I had to Google, all this kind of stuff, where it's like what was the web of knowledge that existed outside of the docs that they thought I knew that I didn't know. And that's really one of the best ways for kind of new people to get involved, because they don't have to fake being new like a core contributor or something might. And I think a lot of projects have started having kind of like, newbie friendly or good first bug or, kind of tagging. And I think, I know Django does this in a number of other projects, having documentation issues open and kind of tagged in a beginner friendly way really, kind of solves that problem where I'm able to kind of identify as a project owner something that needs to be better documented or is confusing, but I might not be the best person to actually write it, and kind of keeping those open and giving that as a, something for new people coming in as a kind of a little fig leaf, so they have somewhere to start, and how to kind of have that first contribution is much more valuable to a project than me just going in and fixing it, because that just kind of cuts off all of the ways that new people can come into the project.
This is one of those areas where I think Python really shines also with regards to some other languages and communities I've encountered. I can't tell you, for the years that I was working in Ruby predominantly, how many times I got told, use the source, Luke, which, while it may be good advice, is like, throw me a bone, give me a hint, even like, which part of the source, like, if you have any familiarity with the project yourself, any crumb trail you can leave would be immensely helpful. And if you don't, then just say you don't, because use the source, Luke, is just not remarkably helpful.
Yeah, definitely. It's the patches accepted of, helping people.
And so I'm just curious if you have any statistics on the ratio of languages represented among the projects that host their documentation on Read the Docs.
So I have just kind of anecdotal knowledge in my brain, but we also, I think maybe a year ago, added a little programming language flag on the project settings. that'll actually let people say kind of what the language is. And, unsurprisingly, Python is vastly overrepresented. I think we had, and of course the vast majority are undefined, where here I think we have like 12,000 projects that are just, have never filled that in. But then we have 3,500 that are Python. And then the next kind of runner-up are PHP and JavaScript. And there's a bunch of there's, a few Perl, there's some Ruby, Julia, because Julia actually hosts their docs on Read the Docs. So their ecosystem has been really, it's been kind of an obvious choice for them. And there's some Java and Go and a few others, like C++ and C#. But yeah, I'd say, by an order of magnitude, Python is the most represented, but then especially PHP has really kind of caught on to it, and there's some pretty big PHP projects using it. And then the Microsoft ecosystem has gotten really interested lately because of our work, with them supporting documenting their open source stuff. But yeah, in general, it's still heavily Python, but there's lots of other people kind of getting interested in it.
One of the first times I ever heard about Read the Docs actually was at ChefConf last year. I was in a training course, and I was sort of carping about ChefSpec in particular. The default doc set for ChefSpec is just not amazing. It's the typical sort of like, bare bones reference. And it can be a struggle when you're getting started using it, trying to figure out how to actually sort of apply this stuff. And one of the instructors said, use the ChefSpec Read the Docs page. It's immensely helpful. And they were right. So it's great stuff.
Oh, cool.
So what are some of the challenges you've faced and overcome in maintaining such a large repository of documentation from so many projects?
I think the big one in the Python world is the fact that Sphinx depends on importing code to generate documentation using its autodoc features. And so this is something we've been working to fix for a long time. But to actually kind of build the documentation for a large set of Python projects, you actually need a fully kind of working environment with that project. So any kind of, import level dependencies, any C libraries it depends on for those imports. This has specifically been a really big issue in the scientific Python world because of they depend on a lot of C, as you tend to when you have, data problems that are large and you need stuff to go fast. And so that's something that's really frustrating, is the fact that, we need to install, 500 megs of, random Python code and libraries in order to kind of generate a handful of, API references for a project. And so we're really trying to kind of, every other language in, with our Auto API work that we're doing is, kind of parse only, where it goes in and just kind of looks at the code on disk and pulls out the information about the doc strings and, the API reference kind of metadata without importing the code. And so we're really trying to kind of push the Python world towards that. And we haven't done a huge amount of work there publicly, but internally we're working on stuff to really make that better. And that's really just kind of, having to have an entire environment to build documentation it's bad for the project users as well, right? Like everyone who needs to build documentation now needs to have a completely working installation of the piece of software, which oftentimes leads to, this is one of the cool things about Read the Docs is it forces you to make your doc builds repeatable. So many projects, the documentation is generated by someone who just like pushes it up to GitHub pages, once a month. And it depends on, some local path on his file system to a config file or something like that. And so actually making it so there's, a specified repeatable build process is one of the kind of unexpected outcomes of having Read the Docs around. But yeah, I think in general, like scaling has been relatively simple because it's all statically generated. So, we're just serving lots of HTML files. We do, at some point, because of the environment issues, we do have backups just because, there's 20 people like at PyCon sprints or something. There's a bunch of people trying to, generate their documentation at once, and we have a limited number of, documentation build servers that can only do so much. But in that regard, having lots of projects, other than, kind of traditional, name spacing issues and stuff like that, it hasn't really, the scale hasn't been a huge issue, except for, just traditional, we need bigger servers and we need more disk space and that kind of stuff.
Very cool. So how can our listeners contribute to the project?
So one of the big ones would be just to help with the development. It is a open source Python and Django app. For the amount of people that use Read the Docs, we get a surprisingly few number of contributors. The people I've talked to, a lot of that is because, they fall into like one or two camps. One is like, it already does what I need. And so there's really, I don't have any motivation to fix something or work on it. And the other camp is just people that kind of view it as a service and not as an open source project. So, when something breaks, they just like open an issue instead of thinking that, like I'm going to write a test case or, I can solve this with code. They're just like, oh no, it's broken. And so this is your problem because it's like a website. And so, yeah, I think for a lot of people, just contributing, either code or just being active on the GitHub issue tracker and, helping triage. Recently with that kind of 3-month thing we did, we implemented a fully standard kind of triage process. And, we have a whole, a bunch of documentation about how people can contribute. And yeah, it's pretty comprehensive at this point, in at least around kind of dealing with tickets and dealing with kind of the code and how we kind of do pull requests and that kind of stuff. So yeah, if people want to file a pull request or, if there's stuff that's not documented, you can, of course, always contribute to our docs. They're, just in the repo, with everything else. And then, yeah, if the other big one is if you have a company and you are looking for kind of ways to contribute to the community, we are looking at, sponsorship on the corporate level. And we're going to launch kind of the individual level kind of contributions here soon. But, really we want corporations to be supporting us and, that's where, the majority of the money should be coming from, and it's where the majority of the money in the ecosystem is. So if people could talk to their employers and really kind of, agitate for, supporting these infrastructure services they use every day, that would be another huge, huge win.
So before we move to the picks, are there any questions that we didn't ask that you think we should have, or anything that you want to bring up?
Yeah, I think just like the other kind of, this has been focused mostly on Read the Docs, but one of the other really kind of cool and exciting things that I've been working on lately is Write the Docs, which is kind of our overarching documentation community. So this actually, as the name suggests, it kind of spawned, and the idea was to have kind of a Read the Docs community conference. But then we kind of announced it, and we found this whole kind of different group of people. And so Read the Docs is actually a very small part of Write the Docs, mostly just in my involvement and kind of helping organize it. But it's this really awesome group of, technical writers, developers, people that work in support, designers, managers, product people, really like a whole kind of really interesting kind of diverse mix of people that care about documentation in software. And so it's in Portland. It's actually the week before PyCon. We've been in May in Portland for the past 3 years. So this will be our 4th. And PyCon kind of came in and moved in on our dates. But so it's the Monday and Tuesday before, and then PyCon is the following Monday and Tuesday after that. So it's annoyingly spaced for people to come to both. But if you want to come and hang out in Portland, I'm based here as well, so I can show you a good time. Yeah, and it's a really fun group. There's I think we have meetups in 15 cities across the U.S. and Europe. And then we do a European conference as well. That'll be in its 3rd year, and we're still deciding where, but it's been in Budapest and Prague the previous 2 years. So yeah, so it's just this really kind of cool group of people that, span kind of all different kinds of job titles and backgrounds. And it's beautiful because it's kind of has gender diversity built in. Because basically the whole thing's been 50-50 in speakers and everything from the start, just kind of as a artifact of it not being a development kind of specific conference. And so it's been really exciting and fun to have kind of this real kind of diverse and interesting community of people. And we didn't really have to try, like we just have to not screw it up. And it's really a really great group. And so I definitely, if documentation is something you're interested in, even if you don't care about Sphinx or read the docs, it's definitely worth being involved with, regardless of your where in the documentation world you live.
And you mentioned that part of the Write the Docs project is meetups, and I'm wondering if you have any sort of media kit or other starting resources for anybody who wants to create their own local meetup that is part of that overarching organization.
So yeah, we had a talk at the conference last year about starting a meetup. And so, it was the guy who actually organizes the meetup here in Portland. He gave a 15-minute talk on, everything you need to think about and everything you need to do. And so that's really kind of where we point people as a starting point. We have a little bit of documentation around that kind of internally, but nothing, formally published. And then we do have a Slack channel for our community that I think has like 150 or so people, maybe 200. And there's a kind of a meetup organizers channel. So all of the different people that organize meetups for all the different cities can kind of hang out. And so they're a great kind of repository of information of, hey, I have a question, or how do you find a venue, or, all these kind of things. And so that's kind of how we've been helping onboard and bring those up.
Excellent. So if there isn't anything else, then we can go ahead and move to the picks.
Yeah, I think I'm good.
So for my first pick today, I'm going to choose a movie that I watched recently called The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which is a modern remake of a TV show by the same name from the 60s. And it was a very well done movie. It's a sort of a spy intrigue movie, but it has a really good mix of action and humor and character development. And all of the main characters play off each other really well with some phenomenal acting. So definitely recommend checking that one out. For my next pick, I'm going to choose a YouTube channel called Minute Physics. And it's a bunch of YouTube episodes that usually run in the range of about 5 minutes long, and they all have to do with different aspects of physics and, tangentially some of the related science. So definitely an interesting one to check out. And I will leave it at that this time around. And go ahead, Chris.
Hey, thanks, Tobias. So my first pick is kind of an odd one in the sense that it's actually a newsletter. It's by a man named Avdi Grimm, who is a bright light in the Ruby community. I know this is a Python podcast, but whether any Pythonistas are particularly willing to admit it or not, Python and Ruby do share quite a number of similarities. And so I think it behooves all of us in both communities to sort of keep track of what's going on in the other. And Avdi has started a newsletter, an email newsletter, with just a whole bunch of really cool, he's just a very deeply thoughtful person. And it contains links and commentary and musings and quotes from our industry, different things that he's read recently that he likes. It's really great stuff. If you're technical and you like to sort of cast a wide net over resources that you want to be able to delve into to improve yourself as a programmer, I highly recommend it. My next pick is a book. After the Paris attacks of a couple of weeks ago, I know I personally felt like I really wanted to sort of get behind the headlines and try to understand what's going on in the Middle East with ISIS a bit more. So I'm reading this book called Black Flags, The Rise of ISIS. And it's a really fascinating look sort of behind the headlines that focuses on a number of individuals and particular geographic areas. And so far, I'm about halfway through. It's been incredibly insightful and really sort of a view into, the circumstances and people that have made this situation what it is today. My next pick is a YouTube channel. This kind of pairs well with Tobias's pick of Minute Physics, although this isn't physics specific per se. This one is a YouTube channel called Veritasium. a science teacher who essentially does these videos on various topics in science. They can range from physics to astronomy to, whatever. And they're just really, really interesting. Like he did a recent episode on nihilism, on sort of on site in the ruins of Chernobyl. So it's really good stuff. It's a fine example of, in my opinion, some of the best television out there these days is on YouTube and for free. Eric, please give us any picks you may have.
Yeah, so one of my current obsessions is a Thai noodle dish called khao soi, which is just this amazing dish. I spent some time in northern Thailand around Chiang Mai a couple years ago and really fell in love with it, where it cost $1 and you could buy it from lots of vendors on the street, and been trying to slowly recreate it with various Asian markets and that kind of stuff. And I definitely, if people are into the kind of spicy, interesting kind of Thai food, find it at a local, a lot of, it's not your standard kind of pad Thai or those kind of things, but a lot of Thai restaurants will have it, and it's amazing. And then I just saw Brett Vicker, who just does this amazing work on kind of modeling data and information. Just basically all of his work is really worth looking into. But he just published something the other day about kind of climate change and how we as technologists can, help influence it, right? Because it's this global problem that's really nebulous and hard to kind of really think about. And it's this beautiful piece where he kind of goes through, like the problem, the different angles, and it's incredibly well researched and has beautiful, visualizations, as is kind of his trademark. And it really kind of woke up my kind of inner, okay, even though I'm just like a person who makes things on the internet, there's a lot that can be done that I have the skills to create. He talks about, building different tooling for, energy modeling and giving people, better, the equivalent of like IDEs for, thinking about energy and solar and all these kind of things, and just all sorts of different kind of angles and things around that problem. That was kind of the best explanation of the problem space, as well as kind of being something that hit me close to home, being, here's how you can also affect change in our industry. And then one of the other ones I've just been thinking a lot more about is kind of eating, and, this classic, everything is bad for you that was good for you, that is kind of our journalism around food. And this Michael Pollan piece of, he's kind of the classic guy who'd said, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And this is his kind of just article on that I reread the other day on just kind of why food culture and all this kind of stuff is kind of broken and processed foods are a bad thing, and just really about how to think about eating in a way that's kind of consistent with history and not just what, some crappy science experiment said 5 years ago. And so, yeah, just trying to think more about, gardening and eating and having food be a communal part of life that takes time and costs money and is something that I care about, and not, the soylent generation of I just need nutrients and it doesn't matter what form they come in. And I think that was really kind of interesting. It relates to the climate change stuff, but is just as well around being, healthy and how to, handle a very large part of, our lives, which is, eating and consuming food. So those are my picks.
Excellent. I'd like to second Chris's pick of Sig Avdi. I've subscribed to that. I've been enjoying his newsletters, so definitely worth checking out. And I'd also like to second Eric's pick of khao soi, and it's definitely delicious. So if you like Thai food at all, certainly try to find some. So for anybody who would like to keep in touch with you and follow what you're up to and what's going on with Read the Docs or Write the Docs, what would be the best ways for them to do that?
Twitter is likely the best. I'm Eric Holscher on Twitter, and then Read the Docs and Write the Docs both have accounts of each of their names. And so, yeah, I try not to cross too many of the streams, and even though they're very, very similar in nature. Yeah, if you care about the community and that kind of stuff, Write the Docs is great. We just announced our dates for the conference this year, and, all the information about that will be posted to Twitter. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us and talk about documentation and read the docs. And yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I'm sure our audience will enjoy it.
Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, it was super fun. Thanks for putting the time in and doing the podcast. I know it takes a lot of work, and we definitely appreciate it.
Well, we enjoyed doing it.
It is a lot of fun.
All right.
Cool.
Thank you. Have a good night.